This is the aftermath of Flight 571, and it would actually lead to the inspiration for a movie. But before we get into that, you must know that this is Reaper House, and viewer discretion is advised. The 1970s were not the best years to be flying on a plane. See, tens of thousands would perish from commercial flight accidents over the course of 1970 to 1980. But there's one incident that sticks out among them all. A plane disaster so bad that the few remaining survivors would actually inspire the script for a movie. But not in the way that you would think, and probably for all the wrong reasons. Now, let me explain. The passengers on Uruguayan Air Flight 571 came from diverse backgrounds united by their shared journey. Among them were members of the Old Christians Club rugby team, a group of young men passionate about the sport and eager to compete in a match in Chile. Their ages ranged from teenagers to young adults, each with dreams and aspirations for the future. But on October 13th in 1972, that would all change. In cold, unforgiving skies above the Andes, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector sat at the controls. His hands trembled with nerves. A man of limited experience, he navigated the aircraft with a sense of unease, his mind clouded by uncertainty as the aircraft soared through the thin mountain air. Dante glanced at his instruments, mistaking his location for the familiar turning point of Curico. He began his descent towards what he believed to be Barajal Airport in Santiago de Chile. Little did he know, he was still miles away from his intended path, the jagged peaks of the Andes looming dangerously close. Suddenly emerging from the clouds, Dante's heart sank as he beheld the Andes ahead. Desperately, he pulled back on the controls, trying to gain altitude, but it was too late. The aircraft collided with the unforgiving rock, the force tearing off wings and tail, sending the plane hurling towards the icy abyss below. On board, fear and chaos ensued as passengers and crew fought for their lives. Amidst the screams and chaos, lives were lost in an instant, their fate sealed by the unforgiving mountains. But the true horror was only beginning. Stranded in the freezing wilderness, the survivors faced a grim reality. Cut off from the world below, they battled sub-zero temperatures, starvation, and the ever-present threat of avalanches. As days turned to weeks, hope dwindled with each passing moment. The impact of the crash was devastating, claiming the lives of several passengers and crew members in an instant. In the rear section of the aircraft, the tail cone was torn away, leading to the tragic loss of 3 passengers and 2 crew members. As Flight 571 collided with the snow, seats were dislodged from the floor, causing further injuries to those aboard. Among the casualties were Dr. Francisco Nicola, his wife Esther Nicola, and Fernando Vasquez. Pilot Fernandez suffered fatal injuries upon impact, while co-pilot Dante found himself critically injured and trapped in the wreckage. Despite his injuries, he requested assistance in ending his own life, but his plea was refused. He passed away the following day. Despite the grim circumstances, 33 of the 45 passengers managed to survive the initial impact, albeit with various injuries, including broken legs from the force of the impact. But unfortunately, not all 33 would make it off the Andes. Little did these survivors know, only 16 would survive and make it back home, and this hellish nightmare was spent over the course of 72 days. Over the course of these 72 days, 17 people would perish. Every death would leave the survivors feeling a bit more hopeless. But the fatalities that hurt the most were the deaths of Marcelo Perez, the rugby team captain, and Miliano Metho, the woman responsible for nursing the survivors back to health. These 2 would be buried by an avalanche that occurred 17 days after the crash landing, along with 6 others. These conditions would only get worse. Food supply dwindled, wounds were becoming infected, resulting in the fatalities of many others. The food supply was so bad that, with all the food accounted for, it would only last all the remaining survivors a week. Nando Paro, one of the fortunate few to survive, was actually stated saying that he had to make a single chocolate-covered peanut last for 3 days. These conditions were no joke, and all the survivors were thinking the same thing. They were all going to have to resort to eating the flesh of their own family and friends that fell victim to the plane crash. The survivors of the crash that didn't think they would make it out alive actually gave their comrades permission to eat chunks of them in order for them to survive. And according to Canessa, they would let the meat of their friends and family dry out in the sun. It was said to make it more edible and easy to eat. At first, they were hardly able to eat just the skin, fat, and muscles, but ultimately they would also eat lungs, hearts, and even the brains of those that wouldn't make it. And so after 2 months of this was getting old pretty fast. So these 3 men, Roberto Vanessa, Mando Parado, and Antonio Vincenten, would head out on an expedition in hopes of finding help. Their goal would be to reach the top of the Andes to scope out where the closest town might be. These men at the time had zero navigation and climbing skills for the journey, had no map, compass, and would eventually run out of food over the course of their journey. But with all things considered, and just after 3 days, the group would make it to the very top of the 14,000-foot ridge. And to their disbelief, mixed in with the gut-wrenching feeling of hopelessness, they found themselves in a far worse situation than they thought they were already in. For miles, all they could see were snow-covered caps on the Andes with no town in sight. As they sat and looked out from the top of the Andes, it had dawned on them that their mission to find help was turning into a bigger task than intended. Vizentem would head back to base camp solo, while the others 2 pressed on, rationing what little food they had left. With a nod, Vizentem fashioned a makeshift sled out of an aircraft seat and coasted downhill, making it back to the campsite in just over an hour. Pablo and Canessa embarked on a 7-day hike further into Chile, now making it a 10-day trip in total. Eventually, they reached the narrow valley. Here, they discovered the origin of Rio San Jose, which fed into Rio Portillo, ultimately converging into Rio Azufre at Los Manantiales. Continuing their descent alongside the river, they eventually encountered the snow line. Along their journey, they would eventually start seeing signs of human life being nearby. Initially, an empty soup can, and ultimately, on the 9th day, a sighting of some cows. Exhausted, Canessa found himself unable to continue walking, prompting them to halt and rest for the evening. While gathering wood for a fire, they spotted 3 men on horseback across the river. Despite Prado's attempts to communicate, the roaring river drowned out their voices. However, one of the men on the opposite bank caught sight of Prado and Canessa and shouted back, promising to return the following day. True to his word, the man reappeared delivering a note tied to a stone, which he flung across the river to Prado. In response, Prado pretty much explained that there were survivors of the Andes Mountains plane crash and that he and the other survivors were in dire need of help. Sergio Cadelan, the man communicating with Prado, made it clear that he would seek help, and that he did. The news was quickly relayed to the military, and they acted accordingly. Over the course of 10 days, Prado and Canessa traversed 33 miles, as well as ascended and descended thousands of feet of elevation. On December 22nd and 23rd, groups of helicopters would be sent to the crash site in search of the remaining survivors. 14 people would be found and rescued. People and news outlets quickly caught wind of this horrifying yet heroic story of the passengers of Flight 571 and the things that they had to endure to survive. And in 1993, a movie was actually filmed based on the events that occurred. That movie is called Alive. Also, in 1993, came a documentary-styled film called Alive 20 years later. Stories from actual survivors are told in this documentary. Well, that's our story, guys. If you've made it this far into the video, I just want to say thank you, and to please consider liking and subscribing if you want. And as a side note, I think I need to work on my Spanish.